Guys, welcome back to the Lake Norman Business Podcast. My name is Danny Decker. I'm here with Ryan Weber, as always, and today we're excited to be joined by a really great guest, a good friend of mine, a rock star entrepreneur, Mike Yarbrough of Rustic Main. So, Mike, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, man. Glad to be here, guys.
Tell us a little bit about Rustic Main.
So Rustic Main, we do something really cool. It's a ring-making business. So we make wedding rings, but we make them out of historic woods and other unique materials. So we actually have woods from old battleships, World War I, World War II rifle stocks, uniforms, things like that. A lot of whiskey barrels. We got a lot of whiskey barrels in the shop. So if you got a favorite brand, there's a good chance we have it. And the whole point of it is that we want to make rings that have a story behind them, have a meaning. And so I love stories. I love meaning. And so this is when we started coming up with this idea, we knew that had to be front and center. So you come to the site, rusticandmain.com, M-A-I-N, little plug there. You can see that each ring kind of has a theme or has a story. But then the other cool thing is that people can actually send us stuff that matters specifically to them. So like wood from Grandpa's barn or something along those lines, whatever's significant. We've had some great stories come out of from our customers, and just making something that's really unique, really meaningful for them. So you're not just wearing the same wedding band that's just off the shelf.
I love this because as a man that does not wear a wedding band because I hate wearing wedding rings, and you're like, oh, because it tells a story. The wedding wasn't a good enough story to wear the ring, so we've got to, as men, have to come up with a better story for us.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yep.
So, yeah, go ahead, Danny. You know Mike a lot better. I'm learning about his business right now. I'm so excited to take notes on his topic. So talk about your thing, but I'm going to take notes this episode because I have lots of things to learn.
I love it, man. Mike, tell me this. So this is something I've always wondered. Where, you're sitting here, you're trying to decide what's the next product. Where do you go about finding wood from a battleship? How do you go about even doing that?
There was somebody who said, I can't remember who it was, but they basically said that in order to create something new, you basically have to start with, you need three things. You need to know where you are, where you want to go, and then the first step to get there, right? And so the first step is always like, okay, well, I want to do this thing. Like when we were thinking about wood from the battleship, we knew that there was one battleship, happened to be the USS North Carolina, that actually sold some of their decking, the original decking from the battleship. They actually made that available to the public, but they did it in little blocks, right? And it was like $50 or $70 a block. So we started buying that and eventually reached out to him and said, hey, can we buy a bunch of this stuff? And we were able to. Same thing with the rifle stocks. It was kind of like, well, once I had the idea of what kind of ring we wanted to make, and we've got this really cool one that's got like this Springfield 1903 dark walnut wood, and then half of the ring is actually a olive green wool from a World War I uniform. So like and then split down the middle by gold or silver or something along those lines. So once I had the vision for it, it was like, well, let's go find out how, who has these things. And so it's just, you got the vision. A lot of people can get the vision of what they want to do. It's just, what's the first next step that I have to do in the process? And it could be something as simple as getting your domain or whatever. But when you're, putting the product together, it really is just a series of overcoming hurdles until you have something that you're proud of.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Mike, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this episode, just tell me a little bit about your journey into what you're doing now, because this is not something you've been doing your entire adult life, correct?
No, you're absolutely right. So I've always been a tinkerer, and I've always been somebody who worked with my hands. I grew up in the country for the most part, and so anything we wanted to do that was fun. Well, not anything, but a lot of things we wanted to do that was fun. You had to kind of make your own stuff. Like you had to make your own swords and spears and whatever, kind of He-Man-esque type of stuff back in the 80s.
Things that are fun, swords and spears and all that.
Man stuff. But anyhow, so that was, I've always worked with my hands. That's just been a big part of my life. But when I got out of the military, probably back in 98, 99 time frame, I got into the IT field. I started writing code after a few years of doing support and different things like that. And I really enjoyed some aspects of creating things from a logical standpoint, even from a virtual standpoint, because you could create something, fail at it, create it again, and it's not like you've worked really hard on this piece of furniture for 3 months and then it goes to crap. So there's an aspects of that I really enjoyed. But there was also a part of me that wanted to do something, hands-on, something tangible, something that people could hold and really cherish. And so but a lot of the lessons that I've learned that have actually helped me tremendously in business come directly from my experience in 15 years in the IT field.
Love it. Love it, man.
So IT has helped you create awesome wedding rings.
It's weird. It's like I basically went from a cushy,
Mike, you are one of the most unique people I think I've ever met. I love it.
Well, so the go from like a cushy, get coffee whenever you want to kind of IT job, dev kind of, if you can imagine like the dev actually looks a lot like what your guys' studio kind of looks like. It's just this sort of industrial spot with a bunch
of. It's a basement.
It's a basement. Well, that kind of environment where you got a 401k and all that kind of stuff. And I basically went from that to making circles in my garage and then hired some other people to make circles. And now we sell those circles, right? So it's a very different kind of thing, but there are principles that just work regardless when you're trying to create something.
And that's kind of why we're doing this podcast, is because you as a ring maker, technically, you're going to be able to bring a ton of advice and knowledge for other business owners that are across the board of whatever business they are. And Danny tells me that you are an expert in kind of creating a process.
Yeah. So this comes directly from the software world. A lot of times we think about, I'm going to make a thing as a business owner, and let's say I'm doing custom cards or something like that. I'm doing some kind of, I don't know what it is, something. And I've got my system down and I know how it's going to go. But most business owners don't think about what happens when you need to sell 10,000 of these, or you need to sell, however many of these things. But when you're coming from a software standpoint, it's always like, I may be starting with like 10 users that are using this app, but what happens when 10,000 people need to use it all at the exact same time? And so scalability is always something that you think about right at the forefront. And we did that with this business as well. We've grown over time, obviously in our processes and things like that. And I'm not the only one to take credit for that. But there is a lot of, I do think in terms of scalability, what's the process for making this happen? How do we break this down into its smallest kind of components of what does it take to do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4? And I'm a very creative person by nature. I'm not a super organized person by nature. But if something doesn't scale well and it requires more of my time because it's grown more, then I feel like I failed. And that really comes from my software world. Just because you've got 10,000 people using the system or the software that you've created doesn't necessarily mean that you should be getting 10,000 help desk phone calls, right? It still should be a scalable, manageable thing.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So, Mike, give us a sense just of the scale of this thing, because it's not like you're doing like 2 or 3 rings a week. Like you're putting out a lot of wedding rings, correct?
Yeah, we do, and that a lot of that has to do with just we've. So there's some challenges here. So one is we don't want to be a sweatshop. We don't want to have 20 people all working, 50 people working to make rings, right? We want to be small. We want to be family-like, and so there's a capacity as to what we can actually get out the door. It may, on some weeks, it may go from like we can ship 100 rings to other weeks we may ship closer to 150, something like that, right?
That's amazing.
It really it is amazing.
That's a lot of rings.
But you have to realize that, like, for the probably 80 to 90% of that rings creation is being done by one person. That's not me anymore because we've kind of grown past that. But that means that each person is spending hands-on probably 2 hours or more with each, with a person's ring. And so they very are, handcrafted. It's not a factory assembly line type of thing.
Well, that's what I was so impressed by, because you're doing this in a scalable way, but you've managed to retain that, one-on-one, like personal, handcrafted, like feel. And I feel like most businesses feel like they have to choose one or the other. It's like, listen, either I'm going to become McDonald's and mass produce this thing, or like I can stay tiny and do these myself. But you've been able to grow while still maintaining that quality. So tell us a little bit about that journey. Like, it was just you at first, but what were what was like the first hire, or what were some of the first steps you took in terms of scaling this thing up?
So we launched in April of 2016, I think. No, maybe 2015. It's been a short period of time, but it's been a very wild ride. So, but when we launched, it was me making a few rings in my garage. We had like one sale that month in April. I think it was just, I posted something on Instagram. Somebody bought it, and I was like, wow, this is crazy. We all went out to celebrate, meaning me and my family. And,
the whole team, me and my wife. And
you got to think, I've got a 6-figure job at this point, right? So, but I'm excited because I've sold something that I've created.
Right.
And that's, if you've not done that as an entrepreneur, that's the hook. That's the thing that gets you like, oh my gosh, like people will actually buy what I create. But anyhow, so from April to about November, it was just sort of steady. We had some sales coming in. Something happened in November. I don't know what it was, but I remember we were actually at a family's house getting ready to do Thanksgiving, and my phone kept going, cha-ching, cha-ching.
Oh my God.
And because it's the app that basically is Shopify's app, right? And I was like, what is going on? I'm getting sales. And I had like 15 sales or something that one day. And I thought, okay, it's time to, this thing is about to take off. What's happening? And January of that next year, we hired somebody. And I'll tell you guys, as far as hiring people, it was probably I was the worst at it that you could be. I had a friend of mine who was basically just looking for a job. He's a good guy, but he had done mostly office work before then. And I said, hey, look, you want to make rings? He said, sure, why not? And so he comes over to my garage, in January where it's cold, and I've got a full-time job. So I was like, hey, look, come in here. Here's kind of how I do the process.
Here's some wood, get to work.
Basically, I'll see you later. And I'd come back and maybe he'd have some rings done, maybe not. But we kind of begin to work together on the process. And a lot of that was what actually works. How do we make this thing like consistent? What's the process there? And some of that is, just that whole thing of just getting in there, trying it hands-on, and then evaluating what works, what doesn't work. Not getting too far into the weeds before you can't really determine like what's holding us back, what's the roadblocks and whatnot. Anyhow, fast forward, we quickly began to hire more people. I think we had about 5 people in the garage, including myself at one point. And then we were like, look, we're all breathing sawdust, and it's like way too cramped in here. We got to move out. The business was doing well. I think I had just maybe June of that same year where I'd hired my first employee. I quit my job and then jumped on this full time, and we've just been growing ever since. So
that's great. So here's a question I have. I've sold businesses before, but one thing that I struggle with: do you create the business first? Do you create the process first? Do you build the process as you get more business? What do you find is the best suited to create this system and process to make sure that you don't break the business?
Yep. So there's a lean principle which says make decisions as late as possible. This is hard for some people to do because they want to have everything planned out before they get going. The issue is that you don't really know what you don't know until you get close enough to see where the pain points are. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to wait too long because then you've been struggling for too long, to make decisions. So it's really making decisions as late as possible in that process. And so when you talk about creating the business or creating the process, part of creating that business first is saying, what do I want my end goal to be? How realistic is it that I could get there using this business model? So, for example, if you're selling T-shirts, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend as a business, but maybe that's what you're going to do. You can think, okay, well, I could sell a T-shirt and maybe I make $10 off of it. Well, how many T-shirts do you have to sell to pay your mortgage? Like, you got to sell a lot of T-shirts. Mm-hmm. So now you're talking about a volume business, and you have to think like, can I realistically pull this off? Or is this a really good model for sustaining a long-term business plan? I want to travel. I want to do all these things. I want to make 6 figures a year. I want, whatever. Can you really do that? So that's part of me. That's planning the business. That's creating the business. And that's what the idea of where is this thing going to be in 3 years, 5 years. And then as you get going, I say just start. Just get started is how I do it. And then because it's not like you're going to, show up you're not going to be a superstar the next day. So you got plenty of time. It's kind of like raising kids. Like nobody says like plan out your kid's life and then have kids. You basically say, no, have kids, and then you're going to figure it out as you go along. There's some things you probably should know, like listen to podcasts like this. They're going to help you out, not with kids, but, with business. But, it's like just don't delay the inevitable of like you're going to run into issues that you are not going to be able to even think of or contemplate until you start to grow.
I really like the idea of kind of the reverse engineering. Like, here's what my end goal is. Here's the income I need. Here's what the business is that I want to look. Well, what are the steps I need to take to get there? Yeah. That's a really, really good piece of advice that took me a while to figure out.
It takes us all a while to figure that one out. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. So Mike, you've done a great job of putting systems in place kind of throughout your business. Have you found that makes it easier for you to hire and onboard employees?
Yeah, because what happens is when people come into the door, they see kind of like you did when you came and visited, right? You saw that it was like, man, things kind of flow. There's a step 1, step 2. Things are very delineated in terms of who does what kind of work. And even people who aren't maybe business minded, they still come in and they feel a natural sense of order in the business. I've been a part of some small businesses before where like the owners just almost got to be at every table for every little thing, doing every little piece because it's just chaos. Mm-hmm. And, from the customer's perspective, maybe they don't see it, maybe they do, but definitely from an employee's perspective, you see it and you feel it.
That's that scalability thing you were talking about. You cannot scale yourself. You're
exactly.
not going to be able to clone yourself as a business owner. So if you can create these good systems process, get your brain on paper, and then get the right people in place, you're going to be able to be more places than you physically can be.
And I'll say this too, that I'm good at visualizing like here's a process, here's how we need to scale, here are the roadblocks, let's tackle these things. I hate putting stuff on paper, but it's really necessary. So this is another thing that you can do as you grow. You might find people inside of your business that actually are good at even the small things that you're not good at. Like, let's document this, or somebody go and tell us, like, what are our most successful rings, or the ones we look the best? What are the details that we really want to hone in on? Like, what's the millimeters here, measurements there, that kind of stuff. What's the really nitty gritty process? And so some people are going to be more on that side where they love those details. And then other people are going to be more on the creative side. They want to just do the next thing, the next vision,
Love it. So, Mike, I think it's fair to say most of our listeners out there, they all own businesses, right? But most of us who do not have the software background and the approach that you have, business are probably a little bit more like the chaos like you described. Yeah. So what is a way that our listeners out there can kind of start putting processes
You always
and
say
systems?
step one.
Yeah.
What's step one?
So what's step one for our listeners?
I think the first step should be start investigating things like lean and processes. I mean, you're going to look at processes from almost any industry, but lean's a very good one because it just makes sense. It's basically the idea of, let's just avoid anything that wastes time, wastes energy, wastes resources of other kinds. And you really want to think about, okay, how do I implement these? There's like, I think 7 different principles or something along those lines. You may not want to tackle all of them. Some of them may not really fit with what you're doing. May not be necessary, but start investigating those things and listening to podcasts on them.
Do you have any specific book or podcast recommendations for people trying to start this journey?
Yeah, there's one called The Lean Startup. Eric Ries, maybe? I don't know. But you guys can look it up.
He's probably not as good as this one.
Yeah. Yeah. The Lean Startup, and there are a few. What I found is if you just look up one, you'll find other like resources that are similar. Simon Sinek's Start with Why is pretty good. I always recommend reading about half of it, and then you're good, because it's one of those things. You get the point, you kind of understand, like, okay, I understand what this is going. But it's those kinds of things. It's thinking ahead. It's thinking in terms of scalability. There are a few other ones out there. I can't think off the top of my head. A lot of this stuff I learned while I was going through software and whatnot.
Cool. So shifting gears here, Mike. Give me as we wind down here. What is a ring or a project that you have coming up that you're really excited about? Any like unique stories?
So this is I'm actually wearing one right now. It's a leather ring, and what we're doing is we're actually taking really, really high quality leather. We're stamping it out with some really cool designs. Once again, that have a story, that have a meaning of some kind, so people can connect with. And then we've got these really cool bow tie clasps, is what we kind of call them, to kind of hold it all together. And there'll be so a lean kind of launch of this. We've got one design, we've got one color of leather, and we've got one design for the bow tie, right? For the little clasp that goes with it. So we're not launching with 5 different designs, 6 different leathers, all the options in the world. We're going to launch with a very limited release. And we're going to say, hey, look, this is what we've got right now on the table. We're going to make 100 of these things for you guys, pre-order, da-da-da-da-da. And then we'll come out with other things, and we'll actually poll our audience and say, hey, can you guys come up with some designs for us? What would you like to see, right? And so that's when you've kind of have an established audience is really helpful in that way. But this is kind of the second phase of Rustic Main. So we've got our wood rings, we have our leather rings coming up, and eventually we'll have some metal rings as well.
So where can people follow along with this?
You go to rusticandmain.com, M-A-I-N, and then and just check us out there.
You guys on social media?
Nope. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, of course.
What is that?
Social what? No, yeah. We're Rustic and Main everywhere. Twitter, Instagram. We're not very active on Twitter, but Instagram definitely, and Facebook as well.
I mean, I am not a ring wearer. I despise wearing my ring. My wife hates that I don't wear my ring, and you're making me want a ring. So, guys, definitely check this out. It's something super, super cool, unique. Love the story behind it. Mike might be the most interesting man I've ever interviewed on a podcast, so I highly recommend it. I think you guys are going to really, really like checking out what they're offering.
Awesome. Mike, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate this. I love talking about this stuff. It's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thanks.